They were gods in mortal skin, draped in gold, worshipped by millions, and terrified of impurity. So they turned inward. Kings who slept beside their sisters, crowned their daughters as queens, and carved dynasties from the marrow of their own blood. Behind palace walls, madness festered like a wound, veiled by ritual and righteousness. But what if this wasn't just royalty, but a death spiral dressed as tradition? Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and sorrow, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing we're exploring the buried past together, across time and space. It begins in silence. A stone corridor, cool and dark, cuts through the heart of the palace like a buried vein. Incense clings to the air, not sweet, but ancient. Bitter myrrh, dust, and embalming oils. At its end, gold flickers like trapped. Fire. A boy king, no more than 15, waits, trembling in a room too large for his voice. Beside him, his sister. She wears the crown too. She will be his queen. In ancient Egypt, this was not scandal. It was symmetry to rule the two. Lands was not to be a man. It was to become a god. The divine bloodline was thought to flow straight from Ra, untainted by the sweat of common people. And to mix that sacred current with outsider flesh, even noble flesh, was blasphemy. So they turned inward, brother to sister, sister to brother, over and over. In every generation, the priests said it was destiny. The stars said it was order. And the people bowed. The mythology did not whisper incest. It declared it. Osiris married Isis. Shu united with Tefnut. They told their stories in temples and carved them into walls as if to remind the living that the gods themselves had set the precedent. And so it became divine mimicry, a theater of blood. Every royal marriage was a ritual, not of love, but of protection. Not of union, but of purity. In the palaces of Ur and Babylon, the same breathless silence echoed. There, too, rulers traced their ancestry to the heavens, to the gods of sky and sun, rain and flame. There, too, the notion of divine. Blood created walls thicker than stone. Sister became womb, air, an extension of will. These weren't lovers. They were mirrors. Outside the palace gates, markets bustled, goats cried, grain changed hands. But behind the curtains of gold-threaded linen, the rules changed. Fear shaped families. Legacy demanded incest. And no one, not even the Queen Mother, could challenge it without shattering the entire cosmology of kingship. What did it feel like? Perhaps we'll never know. The records are carved in reverence, not confession. But we can imagine the hush in the bridal chamber, the way the torches hissed as they were lowered, the way one sibling may have turned their face away. How devotion was weaponized, not to protect, but to preserve. This was duty in its most absolute form. No sacrifice was too high to hold the throne, even if it meant severing something as fragile as the soul. A young woman, crowned queen at 14, may have looked into the eyes of her brother, both of them painted in coal and destiny, and swallowed every scream. A boy, raised to believe that loving his sister was sacred, may have grown into a man too hollow to understand intimacy, only lineage. They bore children with names etched in eternity, and faces never shown. Some died within weeks, others inherited the crown already trembling. And through it all, the empire stood. From Karnak to Nineveh, civilization blossomed not in spite of this sacred incest, but because of it. Its rituals upheld by bloodlines, twisted like vines, bound to themselves. But what began as myth would become a prison. This chapter is not condemnation. It is observation of how belief can sanctify even the most human unease. It is a prologue to descent. a whisper before the scream. We are not yet at the edge of collapse, but we see, in the first cracks of divine logic, a kingdom already, eating itself from within. In the quiet glow of torches and the cool hush of stone, we leave the lovers, God's children, behind, their hearts embalmed with duty, their bodies sealed in golden coffins. And we walk deeper, because the bloodline will not stop here. It has only begun to fold in on itself. There is a particular kind of silence in palaces, not the silence of peace, but of expectation. It echoes through marble halls, through corridors lined with gold, through the breathless hush that follows a royal decree. In this silence, purity becomes law. Not the purity of water or spirit, but of blood. The throne does not forgive dilution. Akhenaten stands in the twilight of Thebes, eyes ringed with kohl, mouth slightly parted as if murmuring to a god only he hears. His face is soft, elongated, almost androgynous. His sister wife, Nefertiti, walks beside him like a shadow of the same thought. Their children follow, each one bearing too much resemblance to both. Their dynasty is a mirror turned inward. To Akhenaten, to many who came before and after, the greatest threat was not rebellion, not drought, not war. It was mingling. To let outsider blood into the veins of gods was to court chaos, to shatter the illusion that royalty was anything but divine. And so they doubled back into themselves. They turned love into preservation. They transformed sisters into vessels, sons into replacements, daughters into reserve queens. A sacred echo chamber formed. The body of the empire was no longer expanding. It was folding, but even gods are not immune to delusion. The idea of purity took on flesh. It walked in the way queens were chosen, not by merit or alliance, but by proximity. It breathed in the halls where no outsider's voice was ever heard. It whispered in the rituals that blessed these unions, reciting the same sacred names in a loop that never broke. And it rotted beneath the skin. Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, was born into this tradition. She too married her brother, not for love, perhaps not even for strategy, but for expectation, for the illusion that Egypt could survive if its blood remained unblemished. Her rule was not free. It was inherited, bound by the invisible rope of custom, the same rope that once strangled her forebears. One brother poisoned, another drowned. Yet she smiled, she ruled, she seduced emperors. All while knowing the gods she served were buried in incest and ash. The delusion of purity did not make these rulers stronger. It made them fragile. Behind closed doors, paranoia took root. Every foreign diplomat was a threat. Every noble knot of the bloodline was suspect. Every whisper of dissent became an echo of betrayal. The royal family, meant to be a beacon of power, became a trembling glass sculpture, magnificent to behold, but hollowed from within. And still, the rituals continued. Imagine a young princess, no more than 12, summoned to the temple. Her fingers stained with henna, her eyes darkened with soot. She is told she will marry her brother, that this is holy, that this is necessary. She feels no desire. She feels fear, but fear has no place here. Only lineage matters, and so she nods. This is not desire. It is obedience dressed in robes of righteousness. Over time, the body forgets what love feels like. When proximity replaces affection, when marriage is duty, not choice, a numbness spreads. The heart shrinks, and only power remains. To the world, these kings appeared eternal. Their temples scraped the sky, their names etched in stone. But beneath the granite, there were cracks. The bloodlines that once claimed the sun as ancestor began to falter. Children were born frail. Heirs died young. Madness whispered louder in royal ears. A god king who sees his sister as both wife and mirror cannot be whole. His throne becomes an altar to self-worship. The delusion endured, even as empires fractured, not because it worked, but because to abandon it would mean admitting the truth, that the divine blood was never pure. That power had been incestuous, not only in body, but in thought, generation after generation. That love had been weaponized. That family had been devoured by the idea of itself. And still, they walked, kings beside sisters, daughters beside, brothers draped in linen and silence. The corridors remained cool. The incense still burned, but somewhere, a mother looked at her child and saw her own brother's face. Somewhere, a king touched the crown and felt it slip, ever so slightly, off-center. The cradle was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a warning dot in the royal chambers, where walls gleamed with alabaster and cedar smoke swirled like ghosts. The birth of a child once meant triumph. Now it brought dread. Midwives kept their eyes. Lo, physicians whispered behind linen veils. Too often, what emerged from the womb of a queen sister was not a future ruler, but a fragile specter of flesh, twisted limbs, vacant stares, bodies too soft to hold breath for long. What had begun as sacred purity now revealed itself as quiet erosion. The pharaoh's son was born with a spine that curled like a serpent. A daughter's skull never closed, and her eyes wept blood before her first moon. Yet the rituals continued. The priests still chanted their blessings. And the mothers, those quiet, gilded prisoners, wrapped their dying children in silks and silence, carrying them to the tomb before the sun could rise. This was not anomaly. It was routine. In the Ptolemaic courts, heirs were no longer chosen from the strongest. They were chosen from the closest, the nearest in blood, even if the blood had long since turned against itself. Uncles married nieces, sisters married brothers, cousins folded back into cousins. It was not seen as taboo. It was seen as obedience. But obedience does not shelter the mind. A king who looks into the face of his newborn and sees his own brother's deformity reflected cannot sleep. A queen who births a child who cannot speak, cannot stand, cannot blink, yet is still crowned heir, learns to grieve without expression. The palace became a gallery of living ghosts, each one more brittle than the last. Yet power insisted. On pretense, these rulers still held court. They smiled with cracked teeth. They issued edicts with trembling hands. They walked among subjects who never saw what they truly were. Porcelain statues held together by ritual and terror. The illusion of stability was everything. And so the crown passed, from brother to sister, sister to son, son to widow. As if lineage could outpace the rot. It could not. Some kings, like Tutankhamun, died before they could speak their will. Others, like Ptolemy XIII, drowned not in battle, but in desperation, fleeing the consequences of a lineage too tangled to unwind. Their deaths were not heroic. They were symptoms, and the palace nurseries remained quiet, the emotional landscape. Within these blood-bound dynasties was no longer one of ambition or strategy. It was one of suffocation. Siblings were no longer siblings. They were chess pieces locked in a game with no exit. A brother feared his sister's beauty, for it meant the court would favor her. A queen feared her brother's son, for he might be king, or worse, her husband. Love soured into suspicion. Touch became transaction. And the children, those born with hollow bones and moon-pale skin, never had the chance to ask why. Outside the palace, time moved forward. Languages changed. Gods rose and fell. But inside, nothing changed. The cradle remained carved from ivory. The crown remained heavy with death. There is a moment in one account, not official, barely whispered, of a young heir who refused. He was born of a sister and a brother, expected to marry his own sister, expected to repeat the cycle. But he wept. He screamed, He tore his robes in front of the statue of Horus and cried out that his blood was cursed. The priests dragged him from the temple, but not before his voice had shaken the silence. He died a year later. No explanation, no body, but perhaps in that cry, the illusion cracked. This chapter of history is not only written in limestone and lineage charts, it is written in bones, in the curved spines of mummified infants, in the narrowed hips and cleft palates preserved beneath gold masks, in the fragments of lullabies sung by mothers who knew their children would not see the harvest. Cradle once held gods. Now it holds echoes. And as the blood thinned and curled, as madness seeped into the marble, the rulers began to speak less, to trust no one, to watch their siblings with both longing and terror. The crown, too, grew heavier, no longer a symbol of divinity, but of a pact with something irreversible, a pact signed in wombs, paid for in graves. The throne room is warm, too warm. Braziers burn low in the corners, their flames restless, shadows twitching like insects. A scribe stands frozen, pen poised, eyes fixed not on parchment, but on the man before him. The king, the god, the brother-husband, Ptolemy. 8 lurches across the marble floor, robes trailing like rotted sails. His eyes are blood-rimmed, unfocused. His lips twitch, muttering curses or prayers. No one can tell anymore. Behind him, a procession of bodies. Courtiers, priests, a child dragged by her wrist. His daughter, maybe his niece. Possibly both. Madness, once hidden behind veils of ritual, now takes the throne unmasked. In Egypt, the divine bloodline had always demanded obedience, from subjects, from spouses, from the body itself. But in these final generations, the bloodline began to scream. It festered in bone and brain, twisted through the wombs of queen sisters, and erupted in the minds of kings. Ptolemy VIII, known in secret as Physkon, the bloated one, was not merely cruel. He was unmoored. His reign was marked by paranoia, exile, and incestuous revivals. He banished his own wife's sister, only to remarry her years later. He poisoned family members in secret and killed their children in public. His court was a theater of ritualized grief, where betrayal played nightly and loyalty was repaid in funerals. And yet he was not alone. Across the ocean, high in the Andes, the royal houses of the Inca mirrored this descent. In Cusco, the Sapa Inca sat above the clouds, dressed in gold, his sister wife beside him, her gaze cold and resigned. There, too, the gods had once blessed incest. It preserved divine will. It channeled cosmic energy through blood. But by the 16th century, that blood had thickened. Princes feuded. Brothers poisoned ceremonial cups. Daughters were forced into unions that made them queens and prisoners in the same breath. In both worlds, Nile and Andes, the crown became a mask. Behind it, fear. Not fear of conquest, not even death, but fear of dilution, of being forgotten, of becoming mortal. And so the gods turned against their own flesh. A boy prince is found strangled in his chambers, fingers still curled as if trying to grasp breath. A sister queen, 9 months with child, is accused of disloyalty and vanishes before dawn. Whispers coil around the palace like smoke, that she was buried alive, that the baby was born breathing and burned. In these halls, love is indistinguishable from possession. Power pulses through family like a fever. A king stares into the eyes of his twin sister, now wife, now rival. He sees not affection, but prophecy, that she will birth his downfall, that she will raise a son not of his seed. The paranoia consumes him. He removes her tongue, keeps her alive, dresses her in white, makes her walk beside him during processions, mute and trembling, as if to declare to the gods that she is his and always will be. And still, the people kneel. They do not see madness. They see continuity. They see gold, tradition, the weight of centuries. But the palace walls are beginning to sweat. The foundation trembles with secrets. The gods have grown weary of being embodied in flesh so broken. Outside, the winds change. Empires rise beyond the borders. Rome eyes Egypt. Spanish ships approach Peru. The old bloodlines, once pure, once powerful, begin to fracture. But the gods do not surrender. They tighten their grip. The final years of these dynasties are soaked in hallucination. Rulers speak to ancestors in their sleep. They bathe in oils meant to purify the soul, but emerge smelling of rot. They demand offerings, not of grain, but of nephews, nieces, siblings, flesh for continuity. And always, the crown remains, untouched, immaculate. Heavy. This is not just madness. It is a logic taken to its fatal conclusion. When power is bred into itself, it becomes blind. When kings become gods, they lose the right to be human. And when families marry only within, they become echo chambers of fear, amplifying every whisper into prophecy, every doubt into doom. In the end, it is not war that topples these throne, as it is the unbearable weight of being divine and trapped. The prison was not built by enemies. It was built by blood, polished by ritual, sealed with silence, and madness was merely the key. The walls are still standing. In Memphis, in Cusco, in Alexandria, the palaces remain grand. The columns are carved with victories, the courtyards heavy with fragrance, jasmine, dust, and old blood. The people still bow. The festivals still burn. But beneath the marble, something has begun to die. It does not arrive with war drums. It does not storm the gates. Collapse is quieter than that. It begins in the womb. The royal line, once a blazing torch passed from sibling to sibling, begins to flicker. The heirs are fewer now. Some are born too weak to breathe, others too broken to be crowned. And still, the rituals demand continuity. So the crown is passed to children too young, to cousins barely known, to puppets propped up by old priests. With trembling hands. In this new silence, the empire loses its shape. The people grow restless. Food grows scarce. Nobles whisper of change. But inside the palace, the mirrors are polished brighter. The processions grow longer. The gods are fed more offerings. Denial becomes divine. A queen walks through the hall of ancestors, her gown trailing. Behind like spilled ink, she is the last of her line. The last sister, the last daughter. She has buried 3 infants. Her face is painted, her smile rigid, but her eyes are empty. She speaks to no one. She leaves no heir. The empire does not fall in a single moment. It unravels. The outer provinces rebel, quietly at first. Roads go unpatrolled. Temples are raided. The farmers stop sending grain. But the royal court does not move. They are trapped inside their own mythology, paralyzed by the belief that they are eternal. They do not see the rot, even as it climbs. Their own family tree. What once was divine is now diseased. In Egypt, the last Ptolemies rule in name only. Roman emissaries come and go with increasing boldness. The Nile floods irregularly. The people speak in softer tones, no longer out of reverence, but caution. The gods are losing their teeth. In Peru, the Inca court fractures. Sepa Inca Huayna Capac dies of fever, his sons clawing for the throne before his ashes are cold. Civil war ignites. Brother against brother, both sons of a sister wife. The empire that once commanded mountains begins to buckle under its own inheritance. And still, the crowns are polished. The royal bloodlines cling to ritual as if it can reverse. Decay. They host ceremonies while the city walls crumble. They marry what remains of their kin, praying for a miracle that will never arrive. They speak of legacy, even as the streets outside speak of revolution. The collapse is not dramatic. It is. Tragic. It is the slow suffocation of a lineage that believed itself untouchable. It is the aching grief of a kingdom that sacrificed its future to preserve its image. It is a cradle that no longer rocks, a throne that no longer rules, a temple where even the statues look away. One morning, a young prince vanishes. His name is struck from records. The court offers no explanation, but behind the veils, everyone knows he was the last male heir, the last pure one, born twisted, blind in one eye, and silent from birth. He was hidden. And then removed. No. Banners were lowered. No warning declared. Just another silence added to the palace air. In the end, it was not the enemy at the gate that broke the dynasty. It was the mirror. It was the reflection that grew more monstrous with every generation, until even the gods could not bear to look, and so they fell. One by one. Not with fire, not with swords, but with emptiness. With no one left to carry the blood forward. The tomb is cool. The stone breathes in stillness. Candles flicker against painted walls, where gods with jackal heads and wings of fire march in eternal procession. But what lies in the sarcophagus is not a god. It is a body. Soft-boned, crooked. Boy's name was once wrapped in gold. Now it is catalogued on a clipboard. His spine is bent into a question mark. His skull slightly swollen. His mouth frozen open, as if caught mid-whisper or mid-scream. They called him Tutankhamun. For centuries, history remembered his treasures, not his condition, but the science now speaks. CT scans of his mummified remains reveal a clubfoot, degenerative bone disease, a cleft in the roof of his mouth, the traces of a family line that turned on itself, generation after generation. And his story is not unique. Across dynasties, across continents, the graves whisper the same refrain: scoliosis, cranial deformities, signs of strokes in infants, miscarried fetuses buried beside their royal mothers, bones that never had the chance to grow strong, DNA unraveling itself in slow protest. This is the inheritance of divine bloodlines. Long after the crowns were lost, after the scrolls faded, and the palaces sank into sand and forest, their bodies remained, quiet, motionless, and damning. Flesh becomes myth, but bone. Bone tells the truth. It is the truth the gods tried to silence. Today, archaeologists wear latex gloves and surgical masks as they lift these stories from beneath centuries of dust. They do not find legends. They find children whose hips never aligned, women who died in childbirth at 12, kings who limped, who trembled, who decayed before they could rule. The illusion of purity is not just gone. It is broken, and in its place, sorrow. The royal blood that once claimed immortality is now data. Genetic traces mapped in laboratories. The children of sibling marriages are not vessels of sacred continuity, but symbols of fragility. The human cost of obsession made visible through bone. And yet, there is something unspeakably human in these remains. A finger bone curled in final fear, a jaw pressed shut in dignity. They were not only kings, not only queens, they were children, wives, brothers, trapped in gold prisons, locked into roles they never chose. The world saw their crowns, but their bones tell us who they were, not divine, just doomed. And as we stand now in the dim light of their tombs, not as subjects, not as archaeologists, but as descendants of their history, we must ask ourselves, what does legacy cost? When purity becomes obsession? Because in the end, no blood is ever truly pure, only remembered, only buried, only mourned. They wanted to live forever, not through spirit, not through memory, but through blood, that red thread that binds breath to bone, kings to gods. They carved monuments to their veins. They built tombs that mimicked eternity. But in the end, it was not time or war that broke them. It was their fear of becoming like the rest of us. The fear of blending, of dissolving, of vanishing into the faceless mass of humanity. So they turned inward, closed the gates, married their sisters, buried their sons, and crowned their fears as tradition. What they called legacy was a kind of madness. Because power, when obsessed with its own reflection, ceases to see others. It no longer rules, it consumes. And love, which could have softened the crown, was reshaped into duty, into obedience, into silence. These kings did not just pass on their blood, they passed on their hunger. Their children were not heirs. They were containers, inherited not just thrones, but curses. They walked gilded corridors while their spines collapsed. They smiled for priests while their bodies crumbled. Their names were written in gold, but their lives were already ghosted. This is not just the story of incest. It is the story of forgetting what it means to be human. To love without calculation, to let go, to trust a stranger. These rulers built empires on the idea that their blood was holy, and in doing so, they made everyone else unholy. They ruled over millions, but stood utterly alone, and perhaps that is the final curse of royal flesh. Not deformity, not madness, but loneliness. A palace too quiet to echo, a cradle too sacred to comfort, a tomb too grand to grieve in. Even now, centuries later, their bones lie in glass cases, observed, dissected, revered, but never embraced, never forgiven. They are remembered not for their courage, or their compassion, or their wisdom, but for their lineage, their twisted family trees, their golden isolation. And in that remembrance, they remain trapped. Because immortality, when built on fear, becomes a cage, and blood, no matter how pure, cannot save the soul that has forgotten how to bleed for others.